So how would you respond to that? Do you think there is a coherent theory of anarchist violence? Or do you think that anarchism doesn't have to answer this theoretical challenge? Or do you think that the theoretical challenge plays no part in the actual concrete manifestation of anarchism historically?
Yeah, I mean, I have a great answer for it. But again, like, in terms of like how do you accomplish a revolution, that's not like the basis of how it could be accomplished. I mean, with, say, Che, you know, it was guerrilla war. I mean, he had a particular strategy for bringing about the revolution, and you know, obviously that focused on using violence. In the case of Cuba, it didn't require a whole lot of violence, but as far as anarchism goes, again, it's the general strike. Those are the methods. There's not this idea that there should be any focus on armed struggle or killing people, but rather that, you know, basically there's the general strike. You can shut society down and compel, you know, the capitalist classes to basically, I guess, give up power, so to speak, by being able to, you know, bring society to its knees, because you're the ones that are organized and can control industry and all these different things. The idea is that workers have power, the masses have power, that if you're organized properly, is something that, you know, the government or the capitalist class can't overcome, basically. So in cases of, say, you know, what happened with Nestor Makhno, again, I apologize, I don't know the history very well, and I don't want to apologize for things that people might have done that, you know, they did things like that. But I don't see like an emphasis on violence in terms of like how do you accomplish a revolution. Whether there are good safeguards to prevent tons of violence from breaking out as shit gets out of control. I don't know, maybe there's a big weakness there.
Yeah, I didn't really have a question. I just wanted to like clear something up so people don't get the wrong idea about anarchists killing clergy people in Spain and in Russia. Basically, the Catholic Church, and in the case of the Russians, the Russian Orthodox Church, like Catholicism especially is basically, during that time especially, is always sided on the side of fascists, and they were definitely, and basically, like, they would, I mean, like, as a horrible, otherwise horrible person, Christopher Hitchens has pointed out that that fascism is basically just the right wing of the Catholic clergy, or Catholic populace. So when anarchists are going out and killing clergy, it's not just because they hate religion, it's because these people were siding with the fascists.
Rudy said the only church that illuminates is one that burns.
Once again, lived in Spain, where Catholicism was intimately tied up with the state and was intimately tied up with fascism.
No, I mean, that's a valid point, that in every situation, you kind of have to look at the concrete situation that people lived in. You know, just like there's a reason that Palestinians kill Israeli soldiers. Palestinian killing an Israeli soldier is different than a German killing a Jew in a concentration camp.
Yep.
Because the situations are just entirely different. So, yeah, I mean, that's a good thing to keep in mind. And churches, you know, just like have obviously done a lot of reactionary, terrible things over the years. There's no doubt about that. So.
I'll just bring up 2 points. One would be on Leninism and the sort of question of religion. And I don't have the exact quote or context for it right now. I'll get it to you, though. But, I mean, it's a very pragmatic approach. It's like, look, I mean, even the 1905 revolution, the failed one, was led by a religious leader, which ended up in a massacre. But there's sort of notion that you don't just out and out disregard religion because, oh, it's God and whatnot and everything like that. I mean, you should be able to work with it. I mean, as is in cases of even with liberation theology and whatnot. So it's a very pragmatic approach, I think, at least in the Marxist tradition of dealing with religion, which, I mean, sometimes does end in churches getting bulldozed. But also, I mean, even Stalin during World War II let churches also exist when Russia was invaded to boost morale. The second thing I would say is, you talked a second ago, you're like, oh yeah, well, it's general strikes that are going to sort of win the day for anarcho-syndicalism. But I mean, even at this point, I think the failure is when you live with neighbors, I mean, especially going back to Spain, right? You live with, in Europe, and one country goes anarcho-syndicalist in the middle of the beginnings of a world war. It doesn't really pan out so well. And even then, I would broaden the question, do you need a global strike then in order for anarcho-syndicalism to defeat global capitalism, or how does that going to play out?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, it's a hard thing to do because you need a lot more people involved to do something like this.
Mm.
I mean, like what Lenin did, for example, just required a lot fewer people. In those situations, it is, you know, easier to coordinate what you're doing, and when you're very centralized, it's easier to make decisions and kind of say this is what will or will not happen. But yeah, I don't know. That's definitely a problem. Yeah.
As a historical note, everybody who was against the fascists in the Spanish Civil War were known as the Republicans because it encompassed, you know, various leftist groups that just simply weren't fascists. Do you think, on a theoretical note of centralization, victory to the fascists, it might have something to do with them, you know, not only having more funding, but again being centralized, whereas the Republicans fought amongst themselves and didn't have any sort of unity, like, you know, like Josh pointed out, maybe with platformism you might have more of a unified, centralized, you know, ideology backing everything up and giving everything, you know, some cohesion. The Republicans, concretely, they didn't have that. So I don't know, what do you think about centralization with, at least in principle, with anarcho-syndicalism? Do you think it's, you know, worthwhile?
Well, there's definitely, you know, with like one argument that we tend to have, I think, with the Marxist-Leninists, or when we're talking, like, you guys tend to focus on like effectiveness and efficiency, and I think as far as anarchists go, they tend to focus on maybe like more like rather than like effectiveness, it would be more like the morality of it, so to speak. Not that Marxist-Leninists are moral, that's not what I'm trying to say.
For the record, we prefer the term the composition of the Russian revolutionary sweep with the American efficiency. Sorry.
So, and again, I'm not trying to say that Marxist-Leninists aren't moral, that's not it at all. But the anarchists are typically a little more concerned with like how things are done, and what type of like a result we're going to have in terms of like, well, will there be authoritarianism and oppression as a result of what's happening? And I do get the impression that for you guys, it's more of like effectiveness and results. So like the reason that Marxism-Leninism is a superior ideology is because we can point to these concrete results, like here's Cuba, here's the Soviet Union, here's what they accomplished, these revolutions were successful. And at the same time, you guys are critical of anarchism because it's like, well, look, they weren't successful. The anarcho-syndicalists in Spain were smashed by the fascists. So that effectiveness kind of gives Marxism-Leninism, it's kind of has the upper hand over anarchism, so to speak. And you know, there's some validity to that, because if you don't accomplish a revolution, then that obviously has terrible consequences if capitalism continues, or if the revolution just fails and, like the Paris Commune, a bunch of people get slaughtered. So there's some validity to that, but my sense is, as far as anarchists go, and this is kind of my sense as to why I was like more drawn to anarchism, is maybe coming at it from more of a religious perspective, is that here are some principles about like the right way to live, to not have coercion and a master and a slave. And I never really thought much about how effective or efficient, or what are the chances of success of this movement. Is more kind of like, you know, again, from a Christian perspective, you grow up saying, well, I'm supposed to be nice to people, I'm supposed to follow the 10 Commandments or whatever, like how should I live? And to me, I feel like maybe anarchists think in that way a little bit more than maybe the Marxist-Leninists do.
So let's put aside practicality and let's discuss the critique that anarcho-syndicalism especially just reproduces petty bourgeois capitalism. There are two theoretical points that were brought up, which is that the anarcho-syndicalists have essentially two functioning syndicates. One is a function of production and two is a consumption along geographic distributions. In regards to the productive consumption, because that productive consumption is done on an individual syndicate basis, and there's free association, which means that free association is entered into on the basis of either self-interest of the individual as a free associator, or self-interest as a particular syndicate as it federates with other syndicates. How does this not simply reproduce the dynamics of capitalism, which is the fundamental mode, despite the collective structure of it, is governed intentionally through its rational decisions on collective or individual, or not necessarily even collective, but individual self-interest on the basis of any individual worker, and also collective self-interest or group self-interest in regards to any syndicate? How does that not reproduce the dynamic of capital, where any given worker or individual in a capital society acts upon their own self-interest, and any given firm, any given business, as an analogy, a nearly direct analogy, acts in its own self-interest with all in cooperation with other firms that, for example, supply it, but in competition with all other firms that provide the same service or materials?